All right, so let's start off this kind of discussion and conversation first by learning something more about the creator. She'll tell us about herself, who she is as a person, about the film. And then we'll open it up with some kind of conversation. The reason why I'm behind her is because I want her looking that way and talking to you and not to me. And so then she'll ask and answer the questions that way. And then we've been having conversations earlier during the day about the film, but I want to bring you into that discussion also. And if you have a comment or a question at any time, just raise your hand and first name? Hmm? Lakshmi?
Lakshmi.
Lakshmi. All right. We'll run out and you'll be able to use the mic. How's that sound? All right. So come on, introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, about you, and then the first question I'm going to put out there is, what prompted you to make such a powerful movie?
Thank you, guys. I know this is a really tough topic, and it is absolutely not something I ever dreamed of that would be sort of my life's work. The way that I got involved was I watched the FBI raid my neighbor's house one rainy night, and we could see through a big, huge picture window them going through the house and opening drawers and all the flashlights. And we were trying to figure out, what was happening. I mean, the town I live in is not even incorporated. It's such a small town. And the police would not tell us what was going on. And a few weeks later, I went to my mailbox, which was sort of across the street from my house. And I just, on a regular day, opened up my mailbox, and there was an envelope, a regular envelope, mailing envelope, that had the letters FYI written on it. And inside was a copy of an article from the local paper that talked about what had happened that night. And so my neighbor had been arrested for possession and distribution of child pornography. And in order to get on the radar of the FBI, you have to be very prolific in that world. And that means thousands and thousands of images over a period of time. So on a regular day, maybe like many of you are having today, I stood there in the middle of the street like, what am I going to do about this? I felt like I was at a crossroads of, was I going to ignore what was blatantly in my own neighborhood, or was I going to do something about it? And so I thought, well, where do you even begin? I mean, what do you do about something like that? So I started doing some research, got involved with an organization called International Justice Mission. They mainly do work overseas, except sort of advocacy work in the United States. And all of a sudden, I was sort of sucked into this world of activism, involved in legislative efforts and raising awareness and all different kinds of things for 5 years. But then as I was going around and I was speaking everywhere about this issue, people kept denying that it was happening in their own backyards. Well, maybe it's happening in Philadelphia, but not in Lancaster, not in Kutztown, I mean. And so that prompted me to produce the documentary. And so at the time, I had been in the business world for many years, and it was another kind of mailbox moment for me of what was I going to do, ignore the fact that people just were having a hard time accepting that it is happening in their own neighborhoods, but more importantly, that they could actually do something about it. That prompted me to quit my job and to produce the documentary.
But here's the amazing thing for all of us who don't think that we can make a difference in the effort. Who am I to make? You have had absolutely, positively no background in film.
Right.
None. Just somebody needs to say that's amazing.
No.
That's amazing. Come on. No, but and with that, so how did the process start from there? How did the idea come into your head? There's a vision that a director has to have that only you have inside of your head. I watched the film and was just completely sucked in because New Hope is one of my favorite places in the world. So when I saw the bridge, I must have 75, 80 pictures from that bridge. My kids have grown up taking trips there, and I'm thinking, human trafficking is a New Hope? Yeah. I mean, how do you get that vision inside of your head? What made you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I had some familiarity with documentary producing because my mom was a documentary producer. So my mom was Hispanic and a woman, and I grew up in the '70s with my mom producing a documentary about elderly people who had been neglected and just sort of thrown to the side in Chicago, where I grew up. But so I saw the pain of what she went through in trying to produce a documentary back when nobody knew what documentaries were. And I originally started out as a journalism major, and then I went into business because I didn't want to be a starving journalist, and just completely left that behind, and then was in business for many years. And so when I felt this calling to do this film, I don't have any other word to describe it, but it was really a calling. Um, it's funny because people go, "Oh, of course, because your mom was a documentary producer." And my response is, if my mom had been a doctor, you wouldn't let me cut you open. I mean, it's not like a transferable skill of your mom produced a documentary and here you are. But what I did learn through that experience was the power of film, because what ended up happening with her producer partner was he went on to produce over 300 films related to elder care issues, which a lot of people are dealing with now, Alzheimer's and other kinds of issues that have impacted all kinds of advocacy that's been going on around the world. And there's something like 10,000 institutions around the world that have used his films to help them with what they're doing and working with the elderly. So what that taught me was the power of film. So I knew I loved film already. I watch movies, all of it. If I'm upset, you'll find me in a theater. Like, I love movies. So I knew the power of film. I knew people needed to be aware of this and that they wouldn't have access to information that I had unless I put it into a film. And so, as a project manager in the business world, I knew that I could hire people who knew how to run cameras and to do the basic skills that I just didn't have, and that somehow, it would just happen. And it took 5 years, but it did.
Why PA? I mean, why stay home
Right.
versus this being a problem across the United States?
And I got a lot of pushback about that. I got a lot of pushback about the historic piece. I got a lot of pushback about Pennsylvania. And the one thing I want to say to you is, if you're given a very clear vision of something, live or die by that vision. And it doesn't mean you don't listen to other people, but if something in your spirit and in your gut is telling you something, there's times when you just have to shut out what other people are saying, the naysayers, and you just have to go for broke. And I had nothing to lose, to be honest with you. So why Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania has a great spot geographically, both in that it's the perfect place for human trafficking, in that we've got international airports and seaports, and so there's just all kinds of reasons why traffickers can make a lot of money in Pennsylvania, and people don't realize that about a state like Pennsylvania. But also we've got this incredibly rich history of abolitionism that people also don't realize. They don't realize that if you stepped over the Mason and Dixon line coming up to the north and you were an enslaved person, you had people who were going to try to help you get to freedom. And so the combination of the two of those, to me, was so powerful that I think even if I wasn't living in Pennsylvania, it was compelling enough for me to tell the story. And now when people sometimes go, "Oh, we're a state in the middle of the United States and we're thinking about showing the film, why would we show a film about Pennsylvania?" I say to them, "Have you seen the movie Rocky?" Because the movie Rocky is as a Pennsylvania as you get, as Philly as you get, really, right? But it is about a fighting spirit and not giving up against all odds. And anybody can relate to that, and it's the same thing with this film.
The film has two parts to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like you're watching two movies in one. The first is this very historical reflection on slavery that's very educational about the history of Pennsylvania and its fight. And then this, like, modern day concept.
Yeah.
I mean, you could really split them apart and really have two separate movies. Why the integration? Why did you think it was important to tie the two, current and past, together?
One of the things that was happening when I would go out for many years and talk about human trafficking is people were really scared of human trafficking. It was something very big, $32 billion, 300,000 children in the United States, vulnerable to being trafficked. So you can't wrap your head around it, and you also begin to feel like, well, what can we really do? But then when you sort of pit it against, and that's the wrong word, but when you really reflect on slavery in the 1800s and abolitionism, you really look at what the abolitionists had going against them. They had laws that made it illegal to help freedom seekers. The U.S. economy was dependent on slave labor. Mm-hmm. People thought, even if they were sort of philosophically against slavery, they thought if you outlawed slavery, the entire United States would collapse. So there were many things that were riding against the, making slavery illegal. And so because of the foundation that they laid with their blood, their sweat, their tears, their livelihoods, we have some of the freedoms that we have today, and we don't have the obstacles that they did. So as untenable as that was and insurmountable as that was, if they were able to accomplish what they were able to accomplish, and we still have a ways to go as you all were sitting here listening today, then we have no excuse to do nothing, because there's a tremendous amount that we can do and we're empowered to do because of those who came before us.
But this is a $30 billion, I think you just said, right?
$32 billion.
$32 billion industry. If you go after that, somebody's going to notice. So how do we fight that? How do you combat that? Because this is an economic engine thing that's happening here. With you're going after porn. You're going after, again, the livelihoods of some truckers who are traffickers, who may be traffickers themselves. How do you deal with that in terms of just society?
Right. Well, what people don't realize is that America, so it's interesting because we talk oftentimes about America's contribution to what's happening in the environment and other causes that we care about. But people don't realize that America is poisoning the world through its consumption of commercial sex and pornography. So because of the money involved with it, you'll have children that will be sold in another country and put online for somebody in America to watch. Wow. We are the fuel that fuels this around the world. So, instead of looking at it as the whole thing of it, which can become overwhelming, what each one of us needs to do is say, what can I do? Because there's a tremendous amount that we can do in our own communities. People don't realize in Kutztown, for example, that there are probably hotels and motels where there's sex trafficking going on. People don't realize, all the different things in massage parlors, okay? So in Kutztown, are there licenses that are required for massage parlors, and do they have to be displayed? And is anybody going in there and looking at it? And are there ordinances passed in Kutztown to drive that element of sex trafficking out of Kutztown? Is there training that's going on at hotels and motels? Are there people at truck stops in the area, if there are truck stops in the area, who are really paying attention? Are there teachers who are monitoring their kids in their classrooms, and social workers that are working with children to see that this child's very vulnerable to being trafficked or is displaying the signs? So if each one of us did something in our own communities, we would start to stamp out, like a heat map, we would start to stamp out trafficking in our own communities, and we would see the ripple effect that it would have around the world. So let's not look at the huge, I'm not looking at from liberty to captivity to solve the entire $32 billion industry. What I'm looking to do is what we're doing today with all of you here today, and knowing that then there's a ripple effect of every single person in this room, and then either people you talk to or whatever you do to get involved, and that this film will end up having an exponential effect on people you talk to, who talk to people who do something, who do something, who do something, and then you end up seeing what happens and what Carol Metzger said come true at the end of the film.
One of the things that struck me about the film is toward the end there's one gentleman who's willing to come out and confess that he was trafficked. When we think about trafficking, we think a lot. We think 99% female or women. What is it? Is there another side of the? Is there more to the story with men? Because we know that sexual assaults with men is on the rise. Is there some more that the public doesn't know about that aspect of it?
So the one thing that we tried to do in the film is dispel a lot of myths about this issue. And so where people think that men are traffickers and women are not, that is not true. There are many women who also want power and control and money. And in the Epstein case, you've been hearing a lot about sort of his right-hand person who was really going out and recruiting. And if you hear her talk about the victims that she dealt with, she has no, remorse over anything that she's done. So there are women who are traffickers. And likewise, you hear many times about females who are trafficked, and there are males who are being trafficked, and especially in child pornography, child sexual abuse materials, at an alarming rate. And it was really hard for us to find a male survivor. We spent years trying to get a male survivor. We had one male survivor that we almost put in the film, but I really felt where he was in his journey to healing, he wasn't ready for something like this, and so I chose him over the film. And we didn't put him in. And then later on, we got this male survivor. The sad thing about male survivors is you'll even hear experts, well-meaning experts, many of whom work with females all the time, so maybe that's what's first and foremost in their minds, but you rarely hear males, people talk about males. So when a male is trafficked, and they are trafficked, not only is it hard culturally for them to come out and to say what happened, but then where do they go for help? Most aftercare homes are female only and won't have two sexes in there. Who are they going to tell in their family? Who are they going to tell their friends? Who's going to believe them? I mean, I can go down the list of the stigma that is attached to them, which makes it so hard for them to come out. And we were talking about this at lunch today, and you heard Bill in the movie talk about this. If Holly came with her children right now, and you would have no problem. I mean, the vice versa. If you had your children and Holly was around, you probably would have no problem with Holly being around your children, but you might wonder about Bill. As he was saying, would his own children, feel that their children was safe with him because of the stigma that we have? So sadly, it is when males are trafficked and are victimized in this way, they go through triple and quadruple layers of additional being stigmatized that makes it very difficult for them to heal the way that they need to. They deserve as much help as anyone else does.
In watching the movie and the recovery of a lot of these individuals, I counted 4 or 5 of the cases where, besides the physical and mental, there was a spiritual. Yeah. So a number of them brought out the fact that spirituality had something to do, which I think many of us don't really think about that in terms of, how does that all play, the mind, body, and soul, when you're dealing with an individual who has been trafficked. What did you learn about that, the actual healing process?
That's a great question. Part of what makes a trafficker successful is breaking the spirit of someone. There are tremendous things that you can do to a person's body, as we see in stories, where a person's body can be broken and all different things can happen. And the recovery of the body in many ways can be a much easier journey than the recovery of the spirit, the essence of the person. And so when you're dealing with working with survivors, and many of them had already been abused, when they were younger. Maybe they were raped when they were younger, like Gabby was, or whatever their experience was. So they were in a sad way ripe for the pickings. And so they dealing with the trauma bonding with their trafficker dealing with the trauma of everything that they went through, the shame that they feel, and whatever else that they're going through, and past trauma to help them heal holistically, and the brokenness of their spirit that has caused them to where if you had somebody standing in front of them offering them help and knowing that they could give them help, that they wouldn't take it, that's when someone is broken and their spirit is broken. And so you need to address the person holistically, mind, body, and soul, in order to help them along that journey to healing. And it is a very complicated, a very difficult journey, and that's why we made sure we had Ken Morris in the film talking about prevention, because that journey back to wholeness, or I don't even want to say back to wholeness because so many were so broken along the way before they finally were trafficked, but the what we can do to prevent it in schools and with parents understanding, and people who are education students and social work students and whatever else, to help prevent it so that you never have to deal with somebody who gets trafficked and the likelihood of them dying from suicide or drug overdose or violence at the hands of a John or trafficker. I mean, if you look at the causes of death for a prostituted person, it's horrifying to think of the top causes of death. Because this life is so brutal, and their likelihood of getting out and then ending up on a walkway or journey to wholeness is so impossible. And if you don't deal with the spiritual aspect of it, you may have a Band-Aid situation, but the core of the healing that needs to happen needs to be addressed.
I love film. And newsflash, I have a film minor. Thank you very much. And I know that there are literally hundreds of hours of film that hit the floor. What were some of the things that you wish you could have put in the movie that lay behind, and what are you going to do with all that extra film? I mean, there's got to be some good material in there.
So for those of you who thought that a 2-hour film is long, I could have shown you the first cut of the film, which was 9.5 hours, and we just could have camped out here for like 3 days. There were over 100 hours of footage that was shot, because you can see the wealth of experts and survivors that we had. But from the beginning, we did not want to waste any of the footage the amazing footage of different experts and survivors. So from the beginning, the goal was to release a general film that could be used, where if it's the only thing that they see relative to trafficking, that they would have a comprehensive enough understanding of what it is, that then they hopefully would be inspired to do something about it, or at least tell other people about it. And then we're like, okay, we did that. But there are many people who are on the front lines who may not even realize that they're on the front lines, working with survivors or potential victims every day: teachers, social workers, healthcare workers, police officers. I could go down the list, truck drivers, right? So there are so many people who need training in this area, and we have some of the top experts in the world in this film, and stories that will help people understand what this is looking like. So we've started an education arm this year, and what we're doing is we're taking the 100+ hours of footage that are not in the film, and we are creating short documentaries on par with sort of the excellence of this, where we're going to get it into the hands of people who are on the front lines with educational materials, so that it can target truck drivers and teachers and social workers, where they may not have time to watch a 2-hour film, but they may have 15, 20 minutes, half an hour to get what they need to know, maybe in combination with the film or not. But very specific information, like Holly said. What you don't hear in the film is Holly talking about what happened after she went back to school. So she was trafficked. She goes back to school, and at that time, there wasn't language around trafficking. So people were calling her a slut and a whore. And she ended up being bullied in school. And the teachers didn't know. I didn't understand what happened to her. Nobody knew what to do with Holly. Well, that's information that teachers need to know. Bill ended up in the hospital multiple times. Linda ended up in the hospital, and they didn't know what to do with her. They didn't know how to revamp their intake forms to ask questions that wouldn't put her at risk, right? So these are things that people need to know. So we're going to be creating short documentaries to make sure that we get them in the hands of people who need this information with this excellence of the editing and everything else, just like a regular documentary. And so that the films, the footage, we want to squeeze every drop of value that we can out of it. And it's an unusual thing for people to do with a film. We've been on a grassroots tour with it, which is unusual, and we have an education arm because this is not just a film for us, it's a tool in our toolkit of abolitionism and activism, and so we want to use it for as much good as we can.
Great. All right, so see how time flies. That was 30 minutes, like that. Questions from you now. Your reactions, please. Reactions, questions, comments. Let's open it up for open dialogue. Can you head on back? No, she'll come back to you. There you go. Thanks. Give us your name, major,
While we're waiting for for the question, I did want to let you know that another thing that we wanted to do with the film was to have it impact the media industry. Do you remember when Holly said, my keyhole to society was through media? So we submitted the film to probably 70 film festivals around the world because those people who judge and watch films for film festivals are the leaders in the industry. And so this message is getting through to them. What we were surprised at, because it's a long film, it's on a tough topic, it includes a lot of stuff that's hard to take in, is that we've won Best Documentary at 4 film festivals, and we've won like 5 other awards all around. And today, the film is actually also being played at the Polish International Film Festival at the same time you guys are watching it. So this media is,
Yeah.
so the message is sinking in, and we believe that our mission statement is to plant seeds. And so we believe that everyone who sees the film, there's a seed that's planted that will sprout quickly or slowly or whatever it is, but over time that it will take root and it will sprout. And so that's happening around the world through these festivals too.
Question.
Hi, I'm Jaquan. Major is poli-sci. I have a question. Throughout your extensive research, can you point me or refer me to any literature that may point out economic activity during traditional slavery?
Yeah. So you wanted to know if there's literature related to the economic aspect of this, right? Okay. So Villanova Institute, Shay Rose is the head of that. They publish some reports around this. You might find some information there. It's the Villanova Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation. Actually, if you go to our Facebook page, From Liberty to Captivity Facebook, we actually publish a lot of research whenever we come across it so that people can educate themselves. Polaris Project has some research. One of the issues with research, and it's a great question, because people should be asking, how do you come up with a number of $32 billion? Because it's not like there's a registry.
Right.
If you're being trafficked, you just fill out this form. I mean, that's crazy. So how do we know about how many people are being trafficked and what kind of what we're talking about in terms of numbers of dollars, right? It's very hard to get data, and it's one of Shay's missions is to do that. But because you sometimes don't even have people talking the same language. Somebody may see someone as a willing prostitute, and someone else may see them as a victim, and the statistic is skewed right then and there. So you have to speak the same language. You have to have a way of collecting data that is consistent. You have to have a way of compiling that data that's consistent. And so a lot of these are extrapolations based on qualitative data as opposed to quantitative data. But there is a movement towards doing that, and there are certain organizations like Polaris Project, Shay's organization, Villanova Institute, Shared Hope International started a report card years ago, and when I first started on the film, I think Pennsylvania had like a D or an F. I think maybe it was a D, where they look at various aspects of what's happening in that state legally to address sex trafficking. And then they will rate each of those and then give a report card, and then they'll celebrate those that go up. And it put a lot of pressure between states to compete with each other. And so you've seen a general movement, which is great, in laws, including Pennsylvania, which now maybe is at a B. You can go to I'll publish stuff as stuff comes up. And you can go to like those different websites and see if you can get information, or you can decide you want to dedicate your life to this and help us get the data that we need, because it is really needed.
Speaking of that, what laws are currently in place about sex trafficking? What did you find out about how we're dealing with it? I mean, Switzerland came up with a hammer, right. but what's going on in Pennsylvania specifically about the issue?
Yeah, I mean, Pennsylvania has come a long way since I first started in this. It took, I believe, 3 years for a law to be passed for there to even be the trafficking hotline like posted in like train stations and bus stations. It's like a no-brainer, right? So it took a long time to have that posted. And next time you're in a train or bus station, see if you find that trafficking hotline. Then there was a discrepancy between the state law and the federal law in terms of the definition of trafficking. So that whole definition, force, fraud, coercion, and that type of thing, there was that federal definition. And so what would happen is you would see cases where they would bump it to the federal level because there was a heavier penalty. And they would try to figure out, did they move them across state lines? What did they do? So it could be a federal case, because the state laws were not in line and as strict, and the sentencing, obviously, with the federal. That changed in Pennsylvania, thank goodness, a few years ago. There have been movements towards like safe harbor laws. There's a push right now with regards to, if a victim is treated like a criminal in this system, what is the impact on a victim? So if you arrest them and you put them in jail and then you treat them like a criminal, there is some pros and cons of arguments that we've heard, because some people you'll hear say that if you don't take them into custody and if you don't have a way of getting them out, you'll have a hard time helping them. But there are other people saying, listen, these people have already been traumatized so much that if you treat them like a criminal, and if they committed a crime in the course of being trafficking, what do you do with that? Right. So that's something that is kind of a hot topic in Pennsylvania. And if you watch the news, there's a huge thing going on in D.C. right now where they're trying to decriminalize just the everything related to, I believe it's like everything related to prostitution. And so what that would do is, people think, and Amsterdam was a great model of where if you legalize, prostitution, then you will actually lower the number of prostituted people. And what they found is actually the opposite. In countries like Germany and in Amsterdam, where you have legalized prostitution, you find the demand goes up, and then they actually will have to find. And the sex trafficking crimes go up because they have to find victims to meet the demands. So that's why a lot of people point to the Swedish model, but there is in DC a big, huge debate that's going on. You can see it on our Facebook site about what to do about this issue.
Did I see a hand over here? I thought in the back.
Hello, my name is Ashanae. I'm a junior public administration major. I have like a two-part question. The first part is, are you familiar with the Centoya Brown case?
No. If you said it, I might know what it is.
It's basically about she was a woman who at 16 she was like being trafficked, and she ended up like murdering one of the John.
Oh, and then she was set free recently, right?
Exactly,
Okay, I
yes.
remember the name. Yes.
So, if like the film was like based on like a national level, do you think that you would have included her story in it?
Well, first, bring us up to speed on the case for what you know.
From what I'm remembering, so she was trafficked and she murdered, was it her trafficker or like a John or something, right? A John, okay, which is a buyer, by the way. Language, which was spoken about earlier, is so interesting because you'll call a prostituted person a prostitute or a hoe, and you'll call the buyer who's actually creating this problem a John, right? So anyhow, but so she murdered a John or a buyer, one of the buyers, and she ended up going to prison, and there was this big pushback to get her out of prison, which eventually happened. If I did a film on different survivors, she'd be an interesting person to put in because it makes you really think through this issue in a way that we need to cause a dialogue around what do we do in these situations. It's not very black and white, it's not so easy. There are a lot of complications related to this, and I think she would present an interesting complication, and I think her story would be very compelling to make people really think about this issue in a greater detail than we do on the surface, yeah.
Being the first time I've heard about that story, it seems like that's really, really personal. It makes you think, the effect of it on individuals personally. I'd heard, and again, I don't know how correct this is, so please correct me, that we don't know how close sex trafficking is in our own lives, that we are something like 2 degrees of separation away from somebody who might have been trafficked, and so it's closer than we think.
Right.
Is that true? Are we more involved with it in terms of our personal lives, and we just don't know that it's there than what we really see?
Yeah. I would say that years ago, before the internet, we were several degrees away from it. So years ago, what we called prostitution, which was honestly, it was trafficking years ago. There were things that you had to do to get to buy sex. There were just things you had to do. Nowadays, because of the internet, you can go online and you can literally order someone either to meet up with them at a hotel, or somewhere else. Or you can actually on demand. So you can demand that you want to see this little boy at this age who looks like this, and XYZ is happening to this little boy. So I would say that we're probably closer, my personal opinion, that there may be someone in your life who is, if they haven't been trafficked, which may be a little bit more separated depending on where you are and the kind of people that you interact with. But if someone's on the internet in any way watching pornography, and this was a tough topic for us to tackle in the film. And it's, listen, I grew up hearing it was good for relationships, okay? So it's a tough thing for even me to, to put in this film until I learned the truth. And so anyone who has slipped into, so at 11 years old or 10 years old, they're on the bus or something like that, and somebody's got a phone, and they're like, look, and then all of a sudden that sends them down this pathway of addiction to pornography, like with Mark. Somewhere along that chain, trafficking most likely occurred. Whether they end up buying sex or whether somebody ends up being trafficked. So we're a lot closer to it than we realize that we are. And if you look at any of the research around pornography, and this was not an easy sell for me, if you look at any of the research around pornography in terms of what it does to the brain and the addiction and the dopamine and why it's so easy to get addicted to it, and then there's been research that's actually looked at pornography from years ago to now, and the level of violence and the kinds of things that you see in pornography is off the charts relative to years ago, and that's partly because of what happens to the brain. It's like a drug. It's like when you first take a drug and you get that high, you need to do, you're trying to get that high all the time. Well, it's the same kind of thing with pornography. So sadly, what's happening to our kids whose brains are not fully developed, who have no way of processing what it is that they're seeing, their bodies are just reacting to it. They're being exposed to it unwillingly, unwittingly, innocently, at younger and younger ages, and it is setting them off on this very sad, tragic course where they don't even know what's happening to them until they've had broken relationships and they can't be intimate, and it's ruined their lives, or they're half functioning in their lives. And so I think we're closer because of the internet than we think.
How hard was it to get, because to have the people open up like that personally, to hear her say that pornography affected me in this way, that's right. How hard was it to get the professionals and the people you interviewed to actually come out and talk about, be willing to even participate in kind of a documentary like this?
You know what's interesting? I was involved in this issue for years before I knew the connection between pornography and trafficking. I was at a justice conference in Philadelphia, and somebody was there who was an expert in pornography, and just out of sheer curiosity, I went in to listen to what they had to say, and I was like, oh my gosh. So when I decided to do the film, I'm like, even though it's really tough for me to put this in there, it needs to be in there. I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't. So it's interesting because Mark is already public about his journey. He actually, his organization tries to help men along their journey, and so it was easy enough to get Mark. Dr. Layden, she's an expert. She's testified before Congress, and she's on a board of some really major organizations just trying to really address this. She was easy to get. Lynn was interesting because we interviewed her for the trucking industry.
Wow.
We didn't know about this. And what was interesting was one of my producers pre-screened her, and she told my producer her story and then said, please don't say anything. I don't know if I'm ready yet to come out with my story. So I didn't even know about it. And then when we thought we were going to interview Lynn, we didn't interview her. It was like a year or two later, because it took 5 years to do the film, when we finally got funding to go and interview her. And apparently during that time, she had come to a place of peace with her husband to tell her story. And so I actually had pneumonia during that, so I wasn't there during that filming. And then they came back and told me what Lynn had told him, and I didn't know the whole time what this thing was. I didn't want my producer to betray the confidence there. So it was not, I will just tell you personally, there was a lot of prayer that went into this film, and I felt like another misconception was that women do not get addicted to pornography, and that is not true. And women need help just like men do. And so Lynn's story was very important to us, and it was a surprise.
There's another question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Who are you?
I'm actually.
That's your extra.
I know.
I'm a psych major, and I want to pursue counseling as a job. And I was wondering, I was thinking that maybe I'd like to help people who are victims of sex trafficking and sexual assault and sexual abuse. And I was wondering, is there anything that you learned through this journey and through making this documentary that could help me? Like any advice or any information that you've learned?
Yeah, well, thank you for wanting to make a difference that way. It's really needed. I would say that there's an emerging area of counseling and psychology related to trauma that I think we really haven't dealt with. There's even generational trauma with people who generations ago their families were enslaved, right? And there's some effort to help deal with the generational trauma of that. So I would suggest that you learn about this, because it's a tough thing to deal with survivors. If you can imagine the pain that they're in and the unwrapping of that and everything else is a very difficult, painful journey for them, and you have to be ready for that. and you have to have the right kind of training, because if you don't, in some cases, you can do more harm than good. You need to have the right kind of background in this. So you can contact like Wellspring Living, which is, she's Mary Frances Boley. They have, they're seen as kind of a leader in aftercare homes, the long-term aftercare, which is really what's needed. A short-term solution to it works short-term. So you can contact and ask sort of what advice do they have and what programs that they could recommend in terms of you getting the kind of, from your education here, the additional kind of education that you need to have in training so that you're equipped to deal with it. And it's not only to deal with them, it's also to protect yourself from secondary trauma, right? So even after dealing with this issue for now 11 years and doing the film and listening to stories over and over again and reading articles as I'm posting them, you can easily get secondary trauma, and so self-care and all of that is really important. So you need to talk to an organization that really understands that and can guide you appropriately. So I highly recommend Wellspring Living. They're in Georgia. Gabby and Mary Frances are in the film, and thank you for your service.
There's another question, please. Thank you.
So I don't remember the woman's name, the young woman's name, who was influenced by everything that she saw in the magazines
Holly?
and on TV. Was that Holly? Mm-hmm. And so it's apparent how our media portrays young women and sets them up for vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
What effect do you think that trafficking has on pushing the boundaries constantly in the media?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting question. I haven't thought of it that way. First of all, I want to say if there's any book for you to read to help you understand of any slight impact you may be having, read Holly's book, America's Youth, How They're Vulnerable to Sex Trafficking, I think is the name of it. It's a really good book, and I've read a lot of different things. It's funny because when you talked about the degree of separation, I didn't even frame it within the context of that, and so let me reframe it and say, as a society, I'm going to say this is my personal opinion, when we have films where nudity and a lot of sexuality is in it, like you're eating a piece of gum, in a way we've, and this is my personal opinion, we've devalued bodies and sexuality in such a way that how do we, in any way, why are we surprised that people are being trafficked? Wow. I mean, how are we surprised? If their messages, if you have men who are not getting naked and women who are constantly naked, what is that saying to women about their value, about the value of their bodies, about the value of the intimacy with someone? What does that say to them? What message does that give to them? I'm just asking the question. So, Holly says her sense of value as a person after watching music videos and listening to lyrics and seeing movies and TV and not being in a community where at the time they're engaging in healthy conversation to combat that or counteract that, where would Holly get her sense of self? Wow. Her commodity would naturally be her body. Okay? So by the time that you feel that your value and your worth is your body, when somebody steps in to traffic you, you've already devalued your body. You've devalued the boundaries of your body. You've devalued all of that. And so her argument, and I think she makes a pretty powerful argument, especially if you read her book, is why, we need to really look at that as society, right? When we're checking out of Barnes & Nobles with our kids, and we're standing in line and we're buying them the little coloring book or whatever it is we're giving them, there is, I'm just going to say it, like Sports Illustrated with a half-naked woman on it. What are our children seeing about a woman? What message does that give them about a woman? I'm just asking you these questions and how it plays a role in it. So I think it's something that we all have to look at as we think about ourselves, as we raise boys and girls, as we have brothers and sisters or whatever it is. Are we teaching young people to value each other, to respect each other, to feel comfortable with boundaries in their bodies, and that men and women, they're more than just their bodies. So David Green, the scientist, we wanted to have a family member, and I stumbled luckily upon him. So you've got the male of all, scientist, very successful man, who finds out over years of marriage that his wife had been trafficked. How that must have blown his mind in terms of, and I'm speaking for him, I don't know this, but maybe the things that he thought when he was growing up, and then to find out what happened to his wife, and then furthermore, to have watch the trauma that continued on in his wife, and then to have to tell their sons what happened to their mother, who, by the way, saw the film. We really have to look at the choices that we make, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to submit it to film festivals, because we wanted them to understand that when you're casting people or when you're showing a story, is it possible that you can tell that really powerful story without somebody having to get naked all the time or sexualizing it? Or could you just imply something as opposed to doing that? I mean, can we make different choices that don't lead to the Hollies of tomorrow? It's a question.
Oh, over here, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marche. I'm doing a major in work in criminal justice. So my question, the first one is like all over the place. The second one is a bit not all over the place. But so like I'm all for like changing policies, procedures, and like the way that things are done in general, because it's obviously not right. But my questions are in regards to the revamping of the intake process. So the person that did the intake, was that person a social worker? And are you aware of any organizations that may be involved in a revamping of that process for victims of human trafficking? I think one was mentioned in the film, but I don't remember. And from the research that you've done thus far, would you be able to share more about the roadblocks that people like had and like how they got over them?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, okay. I wish I could remember. Somewhere on our Facebook site, there is an article about a hospital that is training its staff, and my guess is that they've redone their intake form. The person who talked about it in the film is Linda, and she was a survivor, and that's one of the things she's passionate about, but she was a survivor. She's not a social worker, but she's trying to use her experience. By the way, I don't know if you noticed this, but in the film, we did not at all ever label someone as a trafficking victim.
Right.
We talked about who they are, what they do for work, or whatever it is that they do, but we didn't want to label them that way and for them to carry that, because it's happened to them, it's not who they are. Sorry, as an aside. We also asked all the survivors, why are you telling your story? What can we learn? Because we didn't just want their stories, just to have gory stories. We wanted, what can we learn from it? So it's Linda's passion, and she is trying to work in the Pittsburgh area with hospitals where she would give her story, and then they could take their expertise within the healthcare system and then work with other experts to revamp their intake forms, and I'm not sure where that is now. But honestly, if you Google hospital trainings, sex trafficking, my guess is you can land somewhere where they have revamped their intake forms. And when we put together that video for healthcare workers, it's something we will look into more, but off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. Like CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, they actually require everybody to go through a trafficking training, but I don't know if that has trickled down into redoing their processes as it relates to the intake. Like usually a minor victim is there with somebody related to trafficking, and you could actually have the trafficker outside of the room and be asking the minor questions, and they're going to lie to you, and that trafficker is right outside. So you have to be able to look for certain things, discern certain things, and know how to ask certain kinds of questions that give you enough of a trigger to go, yep, this is a potential trafficking victim, I need to take certain action. So that's what I would suggest in terms of that. So I'm not sure which hospitals have done that yet, and it's desperately needed. And then in terms of barriers, um, I would say that some of the hardest barriers are cultural barriers, you know, just like something like including pornography. You know, this is not the kind of film that's going to sell out stadiums, right? If I had brought you a film in the 1800s around the brutalities of slavery that was happening in the South, we would have had people walking out, people might have shut down the theater, and there would have been, you know, a handful of people left watching it. Because of what was happening culturally at the time. This is a tough cultural message because of what we are contributing to as a society, the internet. I mean, there's just a lot of things that are sort of woven in it that make it hard. And I would say if you talk to a lot of people at different organizations like aftercare homes, they have a hard time raising money because part of the reason why they need to part of the reason is because they have to educate people about the issue, then people have to accept it's an issue in order to give money so they can have the money to help the survivors, right? So I would say my personal belief is that if people really accepted it and took personal responsibility for choices that they were making and took action, the whole thing would like collapse. I think it's just where we're at in our culture that makes, and culture's one of the hardest things I believe to attack when it comes to something like this, but we're doing it.
We have a few more minutes. Was there another hand? If, yes, there's one more hand.
Him over here.
Okay.
And thank you for your questions, Bio. These are very thoughtful questions. I appreciate you. It's been a long day, but it's been an awesome conference, so.
First question was, were you aware that Police Commissioner Ross, who is in your film, has like recently resigned from his position over allegedly he didn't. What's the word?
Yes, I'm aware of it.
Okay, so with that being said, how do you feel like for like having him included in the film?
We had to take a look at that when it broke in the news. The bottom line is that one, it's alleged. So you know, we know that sadly with the media the way that it is today, we can quickly prosecute and you know, and hang someone for an alleged something or other. We really thought about this as a team, and the bottom line is that however that case plays out, the work that he did as the commissioner as it relates to this issue, there's no denying the work that he did. There's only a part of it of what we include in the film. So not only did he give us carte blanche in terms of interviewing investigators and other police officers and the sting operation that we did, he said, do whatever you want. He interviewed with us. He is one of the, I don't know how many police forces there are, but they have a human trafficking initiative, and they actually have someone who sits in the SVU unit who is a trafficking expert, who then can help identify in a sexual assault situation, is this a potential trafficking situation, and educate people within SVU. So the legacy that he leaves and the work that he did stands, and we stand behind him in the film, and we appreciate his contribution to the film, and we are not going to pass judgment on this man who we don't know the full story of what happened, but when it comes to this issue and the work that he did there, we stand behind him in the film.
And there was a question here? Yeah.
My name is Mike. I'm a senior, and I was just wondering, what could like everyday, ordinary citizens do to help combat these issues and these problems, and just like changing the culture that surrounds things like sex trafficking and pornography, as you talk about?
Thank you, Mike, for that question. And by the way, there's nothing such as an ordinary, everyday citizen. There are amazing things that everyday ordinary citizens have done. I would say, when people ask me that, I would say first look at what it is that you're passionate about, okay? So if you're an artist and you love painting, then maybe what you'll do is you'll paint something, you'll donate it to help raise some money. Or maybe you'll paint something that depicts an aspect of human trafficking that really speaks to you and becomes provocative to start a conversation. If you love gardening, as Kim talked about, who, by the way, is on our team heading up our education arm now, if you love gardening, for example, then you can lend your skills in gardening to aftercare homes to teach people how to garden. There's something very therapeutic in working with the soil and that type of thing. So I would say whatever you're passionate about writing, then write op-ed letters or write things in your local newspaper. But whatever it is, first examine what it is that you bring to the table that I believe is your God-given talent, and look at how you can lend that to this cause, to local organizations, to a coalition, whatever that is, because if you do that and you connect with it personally and your skills and your passion, you're likely to stay in there longer than if you do it some other way. And so, there's coalitions locally. What county, is this Montgomery County? What county are we in?
Berks.
In Berks County, okay. I should know, I've been filming all over Pennsylvania. Berks County has FREE, which is an anti-trafficking organization. They're trying to open an aftercare home in Berks County, headed up by Andrea McHenry. You can tell people about the film's going to be in the Reading Film Festival, which is in Berks County, right? Is in Reading? Okay, okay, that would help us. Reading Film Festival, November 3rd at noon. You can go to our website, from libertytocaptivity.com. I have postcards too. And you can tell people about it. But I would say examine yourself to see what clicks with you. So for me, I love films, and it became my way of contributing to this. And I would say also educate yourself more. I think if you learn more and read more, and in the back of your mind you're thinking, oh, this is what I like to do. I love to ride bikes, and there's people, not me, but there's people who love to ride bikes. Oh, I could do an awareness thing with a bunch of my buddies who ride bikes around this issue to raise money for XYZ local organization. Tap into what you're passionate about, learn more about it, and it'll sort of come to you what you should do, but do something, and certainly tell people about this issue is a must. Thank you.
Great. It has been an hour. Did time fly? Let's give the director a hand.